The winter of 1868 came early to the Wind River country, and it came hard. Snow fell in October, and did not let up until the aspens along Willow Creek had been bent double under the weight of it for 6 straight weeks. It was in that kind of winter that a man named Amos Kestrel walked out of the high country and into the little trading post at Larkspur Crossing, and by the time spring broke, every soul from the Bighorn Basin to the Green River would know his name. Amos was not a young man. 41 winters had carved his face into something like weathered granite, and 18 of those winters had been spent alone in the mountains, trapping beaver when there was still a market for it, then elk and marten when there wasn't, living in a cabin he'd built with his own hands above the timberline where few men bothered to look. He had a wife once, long ago, back in Missouri, and a daughter who had died of the fever before she saw her 3rd birthday. After that, Amos had gone west, the way wounded animals go to ground, and the mountains had taken him in and asked no questions. Folks in Larkspur Crossing knew him only as a quiet man who came down twice a year to trade pelts for salt, powder, and coffee, and who never stayed longer than it took to load his mule. So when Amos Kestrel walked into Ezra Coombs' trading post on the 2nd Tuesday of December, half frozen and carrying a bundle wrapped in buffalo hide, nobody thought much of it until the bundle started crying. "That a baby?" Ezra asked, setting down the ledger book. "Baby, and 6 more besides, and their mother," Amos said. His voice was rough from disuse, like a hinge that hadn't been oiled in a decade. "They're at the Hargrove cabin. Snowed in bad. Roofs caved on one side. I need a wagon, and I need it today." The story came out in pieces over the following days, the way stories do in small settlements, where everyone has a stake in everyone else's business. The Hargrove cabin sat 11 miles up the North Fork, a homestead claimed 3 years back by a man named Silas Hargrove and his wife, Eliza. Silas had gone out in November to check his trap lines and never come back. Whether it was a fall, a bear, or simply the mountain deciding it wanted him, nobody would ever know, because his body wasn't found until the thaw. Eliza was left alone with 7 children. The oldest, a boy of 13 named Caleb, the youngest, a girl not yet 4 months old, in a cabin with a bad roof and a root cellar that wouldn't stretch past January. Amos had come across the homestead by accident, following an elk trail down off the ridge he usually kept to himself. He said later that it was the smoke that caught his attention first, a thin, struggling thread of it rising from a chimney that should have been putting out twice as much heat for a house that size. He'd gone to investigate out of the same caution that had kept him alive 18 winters alone, and what he found instead was a woman standing in a doorway with an axe in her hands, ready to defend her children from whatever had come out of the tree line, even though she could barely lift the axe over her head from exhaustion and hunger. "She near took my ear off," Amos told Ezra Coombs, and it was the closest thing to a joke anyone had heard him say in years. I don't blame her for it. What Amos did next was the part of the story that would travel faster than any blizzard. He did not simply bring word to town and leave the matter to the charity of strangers, the way most men might have considered sufficient. He spent 4 days at the Hargrove cabin, patching the roof with what materials he could scavenge and drag up the mountain himself, splitting wood until his hands bled through his gloves, and hunting enough meat to see the family through until he could arrange transport. Then he loaded Eliza Hargrove and all 7 of her children onto a borrowed wagon and brought them down to Larkspur Crossing himself, walking alongside the whole 11 miles because there wasn't room for him to ride. For a time, the town assumed this was simple neighborliness, the kind the frontier demanded of decent people, and Amos would be thanked, paid in gratitude and maybe a hot meal, and would disappear back up the mountain the way he always did. That assumption lasted exactly as long as it took the Reverend Josiah Pratt to raise the question of what was to become of the widow Hargrove and her children once the emergency had passed. It was a fair question, and not an unkind one, though it carried inside it all the hard arithmetic of frontier survival. A widow with 7 children and no working homestead, Silas Hargrove's claim would revert without a man to prove it, was, in the plain language of the time, a burden the community would have to distribute. Perhaps she could be sent east to relatives, if she had any willing to take on such a household. Perhaps the older children could be placed with different families to work for their keep, a practice that was neither rare nor considered especially cruel in those years, merely practical. Perhaps the town could take up a collection to see her through the winter and pray for a solution by spring. It was in the middle of this discussion, held in the front room of the trading post with Eliza Hargrove sitting silent and pale by the stove, her infant daughter asleep against her shoulder, and her other children arranged around her like a fortress wall, that Amos Kestrel spoke the words that would echo across 3 territories before the year was out. "There's no need to split anything up," he said. "I'll marry her. I take her and her 7 children, or I take nothing. That's the whole of it." The room went quiet enough to hear the stove ticking. Reverend Pratt, to his credit, tried to give the man an honorable way to reconsider. "Mr. Kestrel, that's a generous impulse, but you want to think on what you're offering. 7 children is a great deal to take on. Most men wouldn't take on 2, let alone." "I've thought on it the whole way down the mountain," Amos said. 11 miles is enough time to think on a thing proper. I'm not offering out of pity, Reverend, if that's your worry. I'm offering because I've spent 18 years in a cabin by myself, and I've had enough of quiet to last me the rest of my life. That woman kept her children alive through a winter that would have broken most grown men, alone, with an axe and a root cellar. I'd be lucky to have her." Eliza Hargrove, by every account, said nothing at all for a long moment. Then she looked up, not at Amos, but around the room, at the collected faces of a town prepared to parcel out her children like livestock at a fall sale. And something in her expression hardened into a decision of her own. "I won't be separated from my children," she said. "Not one of them. Not for any arrangement, charitable or otherwise. If Mr. Kestrel is offering what I think he's offering, then I'll hear it plainly, and I'll answer plainly. But I want it understood by everyone in this room right now. Wherever I go, they go. All 7. It was, by the standards of Larkspur Crossing in 1868, a scandalous scene, not because of any impropriety, but because it upended the entire logic by which the frontier was supposed to operate. A woman was supposed to be grateful for whatever mercy circumstance allowed her. A man taking on a ready-made family of that size was supposed to be a cautionary tale, not a proposal delivered with his hat still dripping snowmelt onto the floorboards. And yet there they were, 2 people who had known each other 4 days, laying down terms to a town that had assumed it would be the one setting them. They were married 11 days later, on the 23rd of December, in a ceremony that Reverend Pratt performed in the trading post itself, because the church hadn't yet been built, and the snow made travel to the nearest circuit preacher's usual stop impossible. It was not, by any account, a grand affair. Eliza wore a dress she had let out at the seams to accommodate the months of hard living that had thinned her frame, and Amos wore the same coat he'd worn down the mountain, cleaned as best he could manage. But every soul in Larkspur Crossing who could make the walk through the snow came to see it, because word had already begun to travel, carried by traders, by trappers passing through, by anyone who found the story worth repeating around a fire, that a mountain man up in the Wind River country had refused to let a widow's children be scattered to the winds, and had married the whole lot of them into a family rather than leave a single one behind. The 7 children ranged from Caleb, 13, and already carrying himself like a man after a winter spent trying to be one for his mother's sake, down through Martha, Thomas, twins named Ruth and Naomi who were 8, young Peter who was 6, and the infant, Grace, not yet 5 months old, and named, some said, for the very quality that had saved her family. Amos took to all of them with the same steady, unhurried patience he'd once reserved for tracking elk through difficult country. He did not try to replace their father, and he said as much to Caleb directly within the first week, sitting the boy down and telling him plainly that Silas Hargrove would always be his father, and that Amos meant only to stand where a father was needed standing, for as long as he was needed there. What struck the town most, in the months that followed, was not merely that Amos had made the offer, but that he kept making it, every day, in small ways that cost him more than the wedding vow itself had. He built onto the small house he'd claimed a plot for outside town, a house meant for one man expanded, board by board through a hard winter, into something that could hold 9. He taught Thomas and Peter to set snares and read sign in the snow. He sat up 3 nights running when Grace took sick with a winter cough, walking her by the stove while Eliza slept the first full night's rest she'd had in 2 months. He never once, in all the years that followed, referred to any of the 7 as anything other than his children, not stepchildren, not Eliza's children, but his, plainly and without qualification, in a manner that some found sentimental, and others found simply, quietly, remarkable. The story did what stories do on the frontier, which is to grow larger with every mile it traveled. By the following summer, versions of it had reached as far as Cheyenne and Fort Laramie, some more accurate than others. In some tellings, Amos had fought off wolves to reach the cabin. In others, the number of children had grown to 9 or shrunk to 5, depending on who was doing the telling and how many drinks had been had in the doing of it. But the core of it, a man refusing half a family when the whole of it was on offer, and a woman refusing to let her children be divided for any comfort of her own, stayed constant, because it was the part that mattered to the people repeating it. In a country where survival so often meant hard, unsentimental calculation, where children were sometimes bound out to labor, and widows were sometimes married off more for the sake of acclaim than for any tenderness in it, the tale of Amos Kestrel offered something people were hungry for without quite knowing they were hungry for it. Proof that decency and practicality were not always opposites, that a man could look at the hardest possible arithmetic, 1 widow, 7 children, a homestead lost, a winter closing in, and choose the whole sum anyway. Eliza Hargrove Kestrel, for her part, never spoke much of the attention the story brought them, other than to say, when asked by a traveling newspaperman some years later, that she had married a man who understood something most people took a lifetime to learn, if they learned it at all, that love offered in fractions isn't love at all, and that a family, once it exists, cannot be divided by anyone's convenience without breaking something in it that doesn't mend easily. She said Amos had told her, on the walk down the mountain with her children bundled against him and the wagon creaking behind, that he had spent 18 years alone, because he'd let one loss convince him that caring for people was a doorway to more loss than a man could stand. Watching her stand in that cabin doorway with an axe raised against the whole of the wilderness to protect 7 children who weren't even his yet, he said, had taught him the opposite lesson faster than 18 years of solitude ever could. They raised all 7 children together on that homestead outside Larkspur Crossing, and had 2 more of their own in the years that followed, bringing the count to 9, a number the family joked about for the rest of their lives, that Amos Kestrel, a man who'd once claimed he wanted nothing but quiet, had ended up with the loudest house in 3 counties and never once complained of the noise. Caleb Hargrove grew into a man who ran his own outfitting business out of Larkspur Crossing and named his first son Amos. The twins, Ruth and Naomi, both married ranchers and stayed in the valley their whole lives, close enough to visit their mother every Sunday until she passed. Grace, the infant who had been carried down the mountain wrapped in buffalo hide, lived to be an old woman herself, and told the story to her own grandchildren so many times that it took on the polished, worn quality of a stone carried in a pocket for decades, smooth from handling, but never any less precious for the wear. What the West remembered, in the end, was not the particulars of a hard winter, or a caved-in roof, or 11 miles walked alongside a borrowed wagon. What it remembered was a sentence spoken plainly in a crowded trading post, by a man nobody expected much of, to a room full of people prepared to do the practical, sensible, divided thing. I take her and her 7 children, or I take nothing. It was not a grand speech. It asked for no applause, and got none in the moment it was spoken, only silence and the ticking of a stove. But it traveled farther than any speech delivered from a stage, because it said something true about the kind of person the frontier sometimes produced. Against all the hardness that frontier demanded, someone who understood, in the end, that the whole of a family was worth more than the sum of its convenient parts, and who was willing to prove it, 1 board and 1 bowl of soup and 1 sleepless night at a time, for the rest of his life.